Thank you for joining me on this episode of the Resilient Performance Podcast. I'm your host, Trevor Rappa. Today, I'm joined by Lee Taft, who is known commonly by his nickname, the Speed Guy. Lee is a world-renowned speed and agility expert and one of the best teachers of movement I've ever seen. He has over 30 years of experience coaching athletes along with consulting and educating performance teams across all major professional sports. Lee has an incredible eye for understanding and breaking down movement in a way that allows him to go deep into the hows and why athletes move like they do. We talk about how he does this in his new course, Certified Basketball Speed Specialist, which we have a link to in the show notes. I hope you enjoyed this combo with Lee as much as I did. All right, on the podcast today, I'm joined by the speed guy himself, Lee Taft. We're here to talk about all things speed and agility and coaching and talk about his new course, the Certified Basketball Speed Specialist. So Lee, thank you for joining me.
Oh, thanks, Trevor. I've been looking forward to this. I've always been a fan of your stuff and appreciate the support you've given me. So this is exciting. Yeah,
you've been a huge mentor to myself and all of us at Resilient over the years. So we really appreciate the time that you're taking. So one of the things I want to talk about starting off first with this kind of related to your new Certified Basketball Speed Specialist course is kind of your basketball coaching career and how that's impacted you as a speed coach and how your speed coach kind of background also impacted you as a basketball skills coach.
Yeah, that's a great question because many of us come from one side or the other, right? We're not, you don't see a lot of head basketball coaches that are also strength and conditioning or movement or vice versa. I was fortunate when I came out with a physical education degree. Usually at most schools, you're expected to coach, which was not a problem for me at all. So right off the bat, I became a basketball coach. I coached two other sports as well, but I got right into basketball right in 1989 when I first started teaching. And I was a player. I was a college player, and I grew up around brothers and a father that coached it as well. So when I was young and sitting at the dinner table, we were talking about how the games went and how movement went. So that's what I grew up in. So having the advantage of understanding the impact of movement in executing footwork, the impact it's going to have on the game was real to me because I was coaching the game. I was calling timeouts and I was calling, coverages, and I was calling offensive plays in special situations. And what I started to realize really young was didn't matter how much I barked at the players or how much I said to do this or that. If they didn't have the proficiency of footwork, it didn't matter. So I was able to marry the two together and understand as I learned more about the biology of movement and how my energy system gets affected. Then I started to realize, gosh, if I can just make these players quicker and faster and recover better, I'm going to have a better chance than players that are not quick and fast and recover. Plus, now my offense looks better, right? So great athletes make us coaches look really good. So I tried to do things that made the athletes better, and then they made me look good. And just because they could make plays, just because they were better athletes.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting kind of idea because I think there's always, this kind of, especially with a course like yours, where it's kind of designed for not only basketball coaches themselves, but it's also designed for kind of the more of the performance strength coach professional as well. It's kind of like where do those roles of who kind of implements this stuff overlap is something I think the industry is kind of always talking about, like who's kind of responsible for what piece of it. And one of the things I think it's so awesome about this course is like the terminology that you use to help people kind of understand everything overall, not just so performance coaches can understand the movements on the court better and also, kind of vice versa. So like, can you kind of talk about where do you think the interplay between whose role is it to kind of implement some of the stuff that you're talking about? And that can be different, obviously, depending on the level. A junior high coach compared to a college coach is going to attack things a little bit differently, but you can kind of talk about implementing what you're talking about in this course based upon, your skill set and things like that.
Absolutely. I think number one, if you have the skill set to teach certain patterning or movements, I think you're obligated to help those athletes. And I, as a performance coach, when athletes came to my facility, I always said, pay attention to your head coach. What they want you to do is what you have to do. They're the ones who give you playing time. They're the ones you have to respect in that regard. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to help you from a mechanical standpoint energy system standpoint of how quick we do drills versus doing a 30-second shuffle drill. I'd rather do a 3-second shuffle drill because that's going to make us faster. But what I tried to get them, the players to understand, and when I talk to coaches about this, if you have the ability to help an athlete and you don't, I don't think that's fair to the athlete. You just have to have a standard at the beginning where you say, listen, I am not telling you to go against your coach, but I, in right mind, can't tell you to do something incorrect. Totally. So I have to teach you correctly. And where we see this a lot, Trevor, and you know this, is how many of us strength coaches are understanding a little bit about physical therapy, and not that we put hands on it, but we understand what you guys as physical therapists are trying to do, so we can respect that now and intertwine that without acting as a physical therapist. Well, if I'm a performance coach, I'm not trying to teach an offense, but I'm telling you, if you want to cut backdoor quicker, this is the footwork that's going to protect you, but also help you perform better.
Yeah, like I think that, you, especially with this course, and I feel like all of your courses that have been not necessarily just how speed and agility kind of occurs overall, like your tennis course as well is kind of similar, that you're giving the technical pieces of the movements of how to be utilized in them in sport, but you're not necessarily talking about the tactical piece of like how those movements occur, like within an offense or within a defense. So it's like you're still kind of respecting, like you said, the kind of the head coach's role, but you're still helping athletes understand contextually how they can utilize these movements kind of in their sport, which is one of the things that I think you've always done such a great job of giving context behind why you do things. So what do you think? First off, why do you spend so much time giving context and educating not only the coaches like myself, but educating the athletes onto why you do the different drills that you do?
Yeah, thank you. And that's a really good, deep question, because I think if coaches understand this concept, they'll understand why words matter and why giving relevance to a particular movement pattern or skill is important, because my emphasis has always been on the skill or the pattern, not the drill. Right. And what happens most of the time is coaches will implement a drill because it's pretty looking and it looks good and it makes them feel really good and the players execute it really well, but it doesn't have purity as to helping the athlete be able to transfer that into game performance. So when I implement a skill and I tell the athletes, this is what's probably going to happen. Okay, this is what you're up against movement-wise. You're going to have an opponent trying to do this. Your footwork is going to either help you or hurt you. And here's why I'm asking you to do it this way. So when they execute the drill, okay, which is predicated on learning a particular skill based on context. Defense, if I'm in a defensive position away from the ball, we might call that 1 pass away or 2 passes away, or we might just say you're in help position. Well, your footwork to get back to on-ball position is best served if you do this. Now, players are looking at that. I'm not forcing anything down their throat. I'm just saying, here's your best option, and this is why footwork done this way is probably going to help you best, but let's try it and see. And now what they've done is they're like, okay, well, he's not really twisting my arm and saying, you have to do it this way. He's saying, this is what works best. Let me try it. And if I have some variability in that, that's okay. Let's build around that variability.
Yeah, I think, like you kind of just mentioned transfer. And again, that's always a concept and an idea that is always talked about in the industry. And again, I think like from the transfer standpoint, like you do such a great job of actually getting transfer, because one of the things that I've always heard you say that has always sticks with me is like sticking as close to the actual skill as possible, whether you're doing a drill or you're implementing a corrective. So what are athletes and coaches kind of missing out on when they get too far away from the skill, or they break a skill? They take a skill that, like a lateral run that occurs in basketball, that occurs at high velocities with high intensities, and they slow it down too much, or they break it up into too many components. Like what are people kind of missing out on when we go too far away from the actual skills that we need to be improving to get that transfer into the sport?
Yeah, I love that question, because that's always been kind of not necessarily a pet peeve, because I truly believe every coach is trying to do the very best and they're trying to help. But unlike you and I, who've spent more time on the performance of the human body and what the brain and the interplay of information coming in to going out is, most coaches don't study that. So I understand why they're doing what they're doing, because they were taught that. And if you have talented athletes that can make anything work, well, then you're thinking, well, that worked, right? Even though it might not have been the best way. So when we are trying to get an athlete to understand how to execute a movement, okay? If we're trying to get them to execute a particular pattern, if we're trying to get them to understand what the consequences are of particular movements, we have to make sure that we put them in positions where when it doesn't go as planned, when it doesn't go well, they immediately get context as to, they're like, okay, now I get it, right? Now I get it. Now I understand why we need to execute the way that I'm bringing it up or somebody else is bringing it up. So it's not that we're trying to implement a drill just for the sake of taking many different layers of that drill. Like we're trying to take let's take a jump shot. If I'm trying to teach somebody how to do a jump shot, and most people who are interested in basketball will understand this, I can do all the touch shooting I want. I can do all the catch, pause, find the rim, and shoot all I want. But then I get in a game and a player closes out on me and is in my face really quick. All that stuff goes out the window really quick. So I have to be in the moment of what's really going to happen. So when we put athletes in a position where they now have to feel what's actually going to happen in the game, the closer I'm to that skill that they're going to need to execute in that game. So from a defensive standpoint, if I have to cut you off driving by me, I'm going to learn really quick that a step slide, a step reach isn't going to work. I have to accelerate my body quickly. So the best way to do that is to go live. Now, what I can do as a performance specialist, I can start to back up and say, okay, they're lacking hip strength. They're lacking maybe some hip mobility. Maybe they have some rotation going on in their body. It's not allowing them to move. Now I can do some things on the side to kind of clean up that movement pattern. But if I can go right back to the live movement and hit those mass and momentum forces that they're going to be experiencing time and time again, now I'm going to impact them versus just going, because I know it's out there and progressions is a big word. Well, progression, you can't progress from the maximal skill. Mm-hmm. Me guarding you, Trevor, as you try to drive by me is the maximum I can go. I can't, adding a weight vest doesn't actually progress it, it regresses it because it's putting me in a state that's different and less optimal. It may help me, it may add more force, but the actual game skill has been regressed.
Right.
And
right.
Yep. And so what we get stuck on sometimes is, well, if an athlete can't do it, we're going to slow it down. Well, I get it if they're a beginner. Yes, I understand. Posture, position, just let them feel something. But now as I go faster, their body gets used to the coordinative sequence that it has to go through to execute that pattern. Going slow, momentum, reaction forces, all that stuff changes. So kind of in a long answer there, but I wanted to give context to the listeners. It's just like teaching any other skill. If I'm going to shoot a three-pointer, all the touch shooting in the world isn't going to help me until I execute a three and say, oh, okay, well, no wonder your feet and your legs and your hips are way off. We got to clean that up first. So that's the reason I try to do that.
Yeah, it's like until you actually assess the skill live in whatever context, whether it's as like a performance coach or as like an actual basketball coach, it's hard to know what parts of it need to be improved unless we actually look at that thing and then kind of break it down from there. Exactly. Yeah, like I just think you've always done such a good job of breaking down the movements that occur in sports. So one of the things that I want to talk about is like, how do you, and I would be interested in see like how it's kind of changed throughout your career. How have you gone from viewing movement, like when you kind of first graduated and started teaching yourself and stuff to kind of now, when you watch somebody move, what are the different kind of keys that you look for that you've, have kind of developed your coaching eye? So do you look at, for like the example of a defender, do you watch their feet first? Do you watch just kind of the overall sequence of movement? Can you kind of give the listeners and myself an idea of how your system of watching an athlete move happens?
Yeah. I thank you for that question, because that's really, really important. So the one thing that I learned that I didn't have as a young coach, because again, I came out with a phys ed degree, which was really good because you're taught how to teach, right? But in phys ed, a lot of times you're taught what we call part whole method. So you're looking at all these little parts first, and then you kind of build it up. Well, that was hard for me because my eye naturally went to the whole movement. So if I'm watching that example that you just said, a defender guarding somebody else and they're moving, I try to look at the whole picture first, because I want to see, are they close to the model that I have put in my mind as to what the shuffle should look like, or the lateral run should look like if they're moving laterally. So I have this model. Now, if I notice the athlete looks like they got stuck, or they were delayed, or if they had to change direction out of it, they got caught and they just didn't respond really well, what that does is it allows me to say, okay, what was the reason that they got caught or whatever? They could have had the perfect foot plan, met the model, perpendicular foot, full traction on the ground, dorsiflex foot, great angle, but the upper body over rotated or over side flex, which we might call a sway or a shoulder dump, depending on which one happens. If I see that, now instantly that gives me information as to, okay, well, great. They had a great foot plan, everything was well, but they just lost control for a moment, which created a lack of integrity. And then they had to refine it, and then they were able to get out of it. And I don't panic. I used to panic when I was younger, and I immediately jumped in and I immediately started teaching and helping them. Sometimes I'd say, okay, let's do it again, stick with them. Then they go, the next time they nail it. And the next time they nail it, they do it really well. So what I was able to do was avoid confusion and possibly frustration by jumping on an athlete that felt like they did everything well. They just rotated, didn't feel it. They just got caught. What I was able to do was now just give them a chance to reestablish the model. They don't know the model. They feel the model, even though consciously they don't, but they know when they do it quick. They can tell. And sometimes you just have to give them a little bit of space and let them go. And that's probably the biggest thing I learned from being this coach that wanted to interject the minute a mistake came, to saying in my head, I'm saying to the athletes, you got to earn the right for me to coach you. I'm not going to jump on you when you make one mistake. If you make 5 in a row, okay, now it's time to give you some guided discovery or summary feedback. Other than that, I got to give you a chance to ride the bike when you're 3 years old, right? We don't ride it perfect. It takes a little bit of time. Once we get it, now we're good. Most coaches are too afraid to let the ugliness happen. If you're afraid to let it happen, learning doesn't exist as well as it should.
Yeah, I think that's like, that idea that of over coaching, which we definitely see people where we kind of take like one rep as, that's just a snapshot in time. And we think that's kind of like the only way that this person can execute whatever it is, whether it's a shuffle or whatever, but kind of understanding that people need to be able to practice. And again, I think that's, it's interesting talking to somebody like you who has coached in such different ways as a performance coach, as a basketball coach, and your development as, someone who has allowed athletes to make mistakes, which kind of, I think give athletes ownership over what they're actually doing. And versus like, I've had experiences in my life where I was like overcoached, where anytime you did something wrong, it was, you're kind of told what to do versus allowing yourself to figure it out. So one of the things that you kind of mentioned there was the model of movement. Why do you think the model of movement is so important from not only a performance coach perspective, but also for sport coaches to understand?
Yeah, well, the model gives us a reference point if we're doing something close and we can be efficient and effective. So if I'm shooting a right hand layup, well, we have a model of that. Now, is there variation? There certainly is. There's a lot of variation, especially now. When I started playing and started learning, in the 70s, it was pretty much one way. If you did it with an underhand layup, the coach got mad at you, right? Now, an underhand layup a lot of times is the preferred method to be able to finish what we might call an extension layup. Now we have all these variations, but still there's a model of picking the ball up off the dribble to getting it into the hoop. Okay, if we're similar to that model, knowing that there's variation, as a head coach, I can quickly assess potential problems or excellent execution. I can ascertain that very quickly because I have a model of it.
Mhm.
If I am a mother or a father of one of the kids who's learning to play, and that mother or father never had experience, never really watched the game, the kid's going out, they don't have a model in their head. They have no idea. They don't know what's right, what's wrong. They just know if the ball went in or if it didn't. And so they can't help it. But a coach that has been around it can use the model for a few things. Number one, it's a way to teach something. Okay, it's a starting point because we do have variation, and variation exists for different athletes, individual athletes with different strengths and abilities, but it also exists for different timing or positions. Or I got a 6'5" guy on me and I'm 5'10". Well, now my model has to adjust a little bit. I got to get that ball out. We have to understand that. A coach who understands the model will understand that. The second thing is it's a great assessment. It's an assessment point, right? It's assessment. And the last one is it gives me something that I can continually evaluate through video, through pictures, a frozen picture of somebody doing it well. And I can use that as a teaching or a tutorial for my athletes. I can show a quick video. Watch this. Watch how Jordan finished on this, or watch how Diana Taurasi hits this three-point shot in overtime, which she just did last night, to keep the game. Watch her follow through. We can show that. So knowing the model allows me to use that. If I don't know the model, I can't actually use that as something positive.
Yeah, that's a great answer, because I think that was one of my first times learning from you, and you kind of brought up the whole model of movement. It kind of really changed my thought and has influenced how I've done things like basically since then, because it gives us, like you said, that ability to assess something, whether it's right or wrong. And one of the things along the lines of assessment that you've said in the past that I really, really like is the skill being, or not necessarily just a skill, but movement being dysfunctional versus low functioning.
Oh, yeah.
And you talk about the difference between low functioning and dysfunctional movements and kind of what your different correctives would be based upon each one of those.
Yeah, definitely. So if I see an athlete that's capable of doing something, but they haven't quite learned it yet, the skill acquisition process hasn't completed yet. In other words, they're not competent quite yet. They're probably working in a low functioning level. In other words, it just isn't coordinated yet. It's not there, but the potential to do it at any moment is there. That would fall under my category of a low functioning skill. Let's stick with basketball for a second. I'm teaching an athlete how to guard someone and how to do a hip turn and cut off a drive. Okay, so the main skill is that hip turn, which is a escaping of space type skill. Well, initially, they're probably not going to do it really well if they've never been exposed to it and if they haven't done it, especially if they haven't played a game like basketball, which requires retreating, right? So if they don't do it really well, but they're close, they're capable, that's going to fall under low functioning. I'm going to buy them time. I'm going to give them space, keep exposing them to it, and they're going to eventually take low functioning and get it up to a high functioning pattern. If it's dysfunctional, there's typically something that's interfering with the potential for that to happen. If I lack some kind of range of motion, or it even could be like a chronic injury, like a high ankle sprain, and I'm stubborn, I'm not listening to the doctor, but I'm still out there trying to go, and I just can't do it. That's a dysfunctional pattern. I'm not hitting the right positions. I'm in pain. I'm just unable to produce any force, and I'm not going to change that no matter what I do if I keep forcing that, round peg into a square hole, right? So what we want to make sure we do is we distinguish quickly as possible and say, listen, let's clear this dysfunction up. If I can't do it, let's take it, and if somebody's injured, I'm going to give them to you, Trevor. Right. You're going to say, Lee, look at, this is what they need to do. Let's clear that space in their ankle joint, so now they can get into that stance better. That's going to reduce the pain in their low back, right? Because now they don't have to hinge so much. They can dorsiflex and get down. you're going to do that for me. But let's say it's a dysfunctional jump shot or a dysfunctional release. No matter what I do, they're going to shoot poorly until that dysfunction gets cleared up. So maybe I give them a couple exercises. They, stretch out their shoulders and their chest, and we get their hand in a better position. And now they start to clear that. So I took that from a dysfunctional pattern that's probably not going to work into a low functioning pattern that just needs more time.
Yeah, I think that's, kind of related to what we were speaking about before, where staying close to the skills. If something is low functioning, it's more appropriate to just slightly alter that the skill that we're trying to perform to it, again, get it back to the skill and improve the overall output and strategy that they're using. But if something is dysfunctional, then something mechanically or something else is preventing them from actually using a more optimal strategy. So I think that's a couple really good examples that you just gave of how we can, help determine something versus low functioning versus dysfunctional. The other thing that, you always do such a really good job of is identifying faults and creating fixes for those. So what are some common faults that you see in basketball and some of the fixes for those? So one of the ones that our mutual friend Ty Terrell mentioned was if somebody has difficulty during a curvilinear run and kind of getting around a screen, what's a good strategy or intervention that you can use to help improve that athlete's ability? And maybe we can talk about a low functioning version of this and a kind of dysfunctional one where maybe there's, like I said, a joint restriction that's kind of preventing them from getting the bend that they need to be able to change levels and navigate that turn.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's a really good one, because when we start to talk about this curving of momentum and motion and controlling that, there's a few things that are going to impede it. If we talk about dysfunction, it could literally be there's something that's just not allowing us to get into the right posture and position to manage that force. We're locked up in the hips. We have some lumbar issue. We have maybe there's a slight scoliosis that doesn't allow us to do it really well to one side. We just can't load the correct way. So kinetically, we're a mess, right? So those are things that we would have to address, or that, someone like you or a professional that can get hands-on and feel what's going on, or somebody like you told me who doesn't go hands-on necessarily, say, these are the things that you need to do to start to clear up their range of motion in their hip or their ankle joint, so that maybe they have some more frontal plane range of motion. So when they plant on a tilt, an angle, they can actually hold that space well. So that would be an example of taking care of a dysfunction. Now, here's one of the things I think a lot of us miss. One of the greatest drivers we have is our eyes, okay, our vision. When we come off a screen, and if I'm coming off a screen, and as I'm coming off that screen, the potential pass coming to me is not seen immediately. In other words, as I'm coming off, the pass is behind my screener and that potential defender, so I can't see it. If my eyes don't quickly catch that, I don't tilt as well. But if I tilt, and we used to teach this, I was a track coach for years, so track athletes running on curves, you've got to help them with their vision. If their vision, well, where we hear this a lot, Trevor, is that what do we talk about in a car accident? If you start sliding, your eyes are going to help you take that turn, right? If you look that way, it's easier to take that turn. Well, this really applies with sensory input and where I am in space when my eyes start to tilt. So let's say I'm coming off a screen and I'm going around to my right. So my right foot is going to plant inside of my left foot. So my left foot would be wider. So I'm going to have some kind of supination action on the outside foot and some kind of pronation on the inside. Well, if I directly get my eyes around and I start to get my hands out in front of me towards the target, it's almost like somebody pulling me through the curve. And that allows me to have a much smoother transition in and out of those very extreme ankle footwork patterns. As where if I'm coming off that and I'm kind of focusing outside of where I want to go, a lot of times the brain just naturally tilts us in that direction, and we start fighting the centrifugal forces differently than we would if we would just go where the energy wants us to go. Then our eyes dictate where that energy is going to be. If I look early and I look soon and I put my hands in that direction, my body gets pulled right behind that force. And so if somebody's struggling with that and they're doing that correctly, now we got to look at the potential for dysfunction that is basically saying, sorry, Lee, I'm trying to get you there. I just can't get through my hip. I can't get through my ankle joint, or because your thorax is so rotated to the left, I just can't get around there. It's hard for me. That's something we have to be able to address. Unfortunately, a lot of head coaches that aren't going to recognize that. And that's okay. That's okay. But people like us, we have to be able to establish some kind of framework to be able to help that if possible. So hopefully that made sense.
No, I think that's a brilliant answer. And I think, it's like taking it to multiple levels of what are some of the kind of like key pieces of that skill and that pattern that allow athletes to execute it successfully. And then kind of it brings it back to what you're kind of talking about at the beginning with your own coaching career, where it's like you would spend more time kind of practicing some of those skills and not just yelling at somebody for not doing it well. It's like kind of almost taking the, that they're not working hard enough, that they're not good at it. It's like, is there something else that we can do to help them improve that quality and that ability? Because I think, from a sport coach's perspective, sometimes they don't think certain things are trainable. But I think when you're one of us, kind of a performance coach, you kind of realize that like every skill is trainable to a certain degree. So it's how do we kind of impact that?
Yeah. Can I mention one more thing on that topic? Because I'll give an example. When I used to work with a player, his name was Jimmer Fredette, and Jimmer was a very good player, good athlete, who when we used to work on that, because Jimmer was a player that came off screens. He came off the screen, caught, boom, that thing's gone. If you're not in his grill quick, he's up into his jump shot. So one of the things we did a lot with Jimmer was resistance, going around. We would use either garbage pails or chairs or a stack of cones. That was the screener, because we would be in a gym by ourselves. So I'd put a band around him. So what the band does is it allows the player to feel position longer and execute a pushing or propelling type action longer. So that helped him feel where his body was as he was going through that, and he could push himself through that turn, and he could get around it easier. And I was almost like a water skier behind a boat turning. I was getting, I wouldn't stay directly behind him, so where if he turned, the band would get caught up on the screener. I would actually whip myself around, so I'm always behind him based on the direction he was going. So what that allowed him to do was really use that outside leg. It's like a skier going snow skiing. That outside edge is critical to transfer energy. So by me using this band, it allowed him to live longer on that outside leg and let the inside leg step through the screen to get into position. Well, if I were to pull him through that, not that he couldn't do it, but it would be very different sensory input, because now he's having to step really quick without having time to push and feel the motion. So doing both are really effective. You just have to decide, what does the athlete need? And that's how we can affect this curving type running. And in basketball, that happens all the time.
Yeah, I think that's an awesome answer. And when we watch sports, we almost kind of think of it just like hard change of directions, right? 45, 90 degrees with a side step, or it's just kind of a linear run, but these kind of curvilinear runs are happening all the time. So I think that's a really great way that, coaches can help athletes improve that ability to navigate these curvilinear runs. That's not, making all these different, wacky drills with a million different pieces to them. It really kind of keeps it simple. And again, keeps it close to the actual skill the athlete needs to be able to perform.
Yes, absolutely.
So I kind of want to move into some of the like movement myths, and especially kind of related to basketball and just different speed and agility concepts in general. So where do you think like a drop step, which you talk about, we want to have athletes hip turn versus a drop step in terms of like a defensive retreating strategy, and like a crossover, where have those kind of concepts come from versus the things that you teach, which is a hip turn and a lateral run?
Yeah. So again, coaches teach what they were taught, right? So way back, even when my dad played in the 30s and and he played when he was actually in World War II, and he got to play on like the Air Corps team, and he ended up playing semi-pro sports. Well, back then he even used to tell me, he said, "Now we drop steps and you don't switch your feet." And he was a football coach, so he talked about false step, don't do that. And of course I'm sitting here thinking, you're kidding me. And if I wanted to eat dinner, I had to agree with him, right? So so here's the thing. A drop step. So a drop step could be replaced with the word pivot, right? So if I'm gonna drop to my left, my right foot is gonna be the pivot foot. If I threw you the ball on the low block on the right side of the court, Trevor, and you were gonna do a drop step to your left, okay? You are going to pivot off that right foot. You have to, because the rule states you have to do it, unless you dribble where you could move your feet. So if you just did that, you're going to drop step. That's when it becomes effective. Or if I picked up my dribble and I need to do a reverse pivot, a forward pivot, or some kind of step through sweep pivot or something of that nature, that's when we want to do it. But in most of those cases, the major priority isn't massive speed, and it's not reactive quickness. It's staying within the rules, and it's moving to create some space for myself. But now when we start to switch over to the defensive end or offensive end when I'm actually dribbling, and I start so let's say I'm dribbling up and I see a trap coming at me. I am going to do what we would call a hip turn. And now I'm going to, as I'm hip turning, I'm putting quick energy into the ground with my backside foot or front side foot, whatever way you're looking at it. And I'm going to pull back. A stop and a jump stop and a pivot wouldn't be effective. I would get swallowed up. I wouldn't be quick enough to get away. So now if we transfer to the defensive end and I'm guarding somebody and they're driving really quick and I cut their space off and they switch directions, for me to stay with them, there's a few things that have to happen. Number one, I have to be able to push completely in the opposite direction I want to go. So if I went to my left, now I opened up at 45 degrees to cut off that hard drive to the right, my foot is going to go in the complete opposite direction of what I'm going to shuffle. If I'm pivoting, what happens there, or if I'm using what we would call a drop step, I have to settle my hips over that foot a little bit so I can actually pivot with some force. And then I have to recreate that angle to push away. Way too slow, especially in today's game. So what happens is my left foot, which is going to be the one that's performing the hip turn, the push off, is going to slightly lift the ground from a flexion of the hips, flexion of the knees, and a flexion of the ankles. So I'm not raising up, I'm just lifting the feet off the ground. And then that leg is going to be almost like a right jab in boxing. It's going to stick hard into the ground. And that is the second thing that's going to happen. I'm going to create a force application angle that meets the direction I want to go. And how I know that is because that leg, if I took a pole and went straight through it, it should come through my front side shoulder. So the shoulder in the direction I'm going to go, right? That is what we would call a kinetic line of energy. And we want to be on that. I can't find that with a drop step. And then the last thing is when my leg sticks into the ground, my knee, I should be pretty dorsiflexed, but my knee joint and my hip joint should be fairly straight because now that allows me to use less power and more elastic reactive energy to go in that direction. And those three things together allow me to be quick versus having to manufacture quickness through this drop step, which is just very difficult and unfair to expect athletes to do that and be fast.
Yeah, exactly. I think your point of like this, the time component, and in sports, talk about how that half a step can make a huge difference, and if you can maximize an athlete's ability to use all of these kind of inherent strategies that we have as humans, these elastic qualities, we can improve speed so quickly just by improving an athlete's strategy, not necessarily improving their force output capabilities or anything like that. And again, I think you do such a good job of designing drills that again focus on improving an athlete's ability to maximize the skills that they actually have.
Yeah, and a drop step really has to be in the realm of a conscious effort.
Right.
As where the hip turn is a subconscious reaction to accomplish a task. So the task becomes the reason I move the way I move. As where when we are forced to do put your foot in the ground, swing your hips open, then push off, that is actually a conscious effort to do that. The athletes have to override the urge to want to subconsciously just react and go. And that's doing them a disservice, and like you said, as innate human movement people who are designed to protect ourselves through either attacking or escaping. We take that away when we start doing these very unfundamental movements.
Right, right. So along those same lines, can you talk a little bit about the difference between a crossover step and a lateral run? And then I would also like you to kind of dive into a little bit of the, making a lateral cut or a rotational cut, the influence of the outside leg versus the inside leg, and why athletes in a reactive situation would use one versus, or in a reactive situation, which one athletes typically use.
Yeah, definitely. So the word crossover, when I first got into this, we all used crossover and I saw it, but I remember I went to a clinic in 1992 out in Portland, Oregon. It was one of the first speed clinics I ever went to, and a lot of good coaches who did some stuff. And this was an area they talked about. And I can remember sitting there watching it and thinking, that's not right. That's not how we want to move. Like, I'm watching them say what they're supposed to do, and then when it went live, they didn't do it that way. They literally did what I would say a lateral run. So what I used to do in the earlier days was I still called it a crossover, but I was teaching it differently. Like, the outside leg led the force production, the inside leg got ready to take its turn for force production. But then I finally said, you know what, they're running. It's not a crossover, they're running. So the crossover came because what was being said was, if I'm going to my right leg actually contributed to the initial force, and we brought the backside leg across, and then we had kind of a high knee, then we pushed down, then we went from there. And I kept saying, is anybody not seeing this the way I'm like? I can't even demonstrate that really well when I try to demonstrate it, unless I went completely slow and did what I call the Heisman pose, right? Do the Heisman pose, we could all do it, right? So what happens is the lateral run, and the word lateral run, when I say this to my players, hey, you're going to laterally run. They run. They start running, and that's what I want. So one of the ways that I used to have the athletes do it right off is just start running and turn your head towards your opponent. And then turn your chest that way, but keep running. And then what happened is they just understood, yes, it's a run. It isn't a lateral, it's not a crossover action. So what happens is, again, in order for me to move efficiently, I need to get my center of mass moving in that direction. And what leg does it best? Well, obviously the leg behind it, the one that can push it that way. The front leg needs time to prepare itself. Well, that is the concept or a principle of gait. Walking gait, jogging gait, sprinting gait, or lateral run gait. We have to have one leg produce force while the other leg prepares to produce force, and how it sets itself up. So if you're faking me out and going really quick, there's no way the old school traditional crossover is going to allow me to even be close to you, because I butt my two femurs up against each other, and that never is effective. We want the two to work together with action-reaction forces, all right? So that's the lateral run versus the crossover. Now, when we start talking about rotational stops, and a perfect example is a shuttle run. If I go foul line back, half court back, whatever, we use a rotational, or what I might say an angular stop. Now, the good thing about that drill is I can emphasize maybe working on a lower functioning area. I can work on an athlete that doesn't like to plant on their left leg. I can give them some quality reps there. The only problem is the inside leg will plant first, and it's going to dissipate the forces of that outside leg. And I'm going to start leaning and tilting away from the direction I'm going before I hit that line, so I can go back in the new direction. And what that does is it gives the athlete an advantage. But now, and we're going to call that change of direction, because change of direction is like learning a dance. It's very prescriptive. I can tell you right foot, right foot, plant, go. I can do that. We can practice that. It's like the icky shuffle. We can practice it, learn it, get better at it. But now when I have to react to an opponent giving me a fake or a change of direction or an explosive move, I no longer have the time to plant that inside leg as the primary plant. And it may happen at times, but most of the time, we're going to do what we call a repositioning of foot. From the footprint I'm in, I'm going to find another footprint that allows me to get that force application angle, like we talked about before, backside foot through the front side shoulder. That allows me to quickly move in the new direction. So agility allows more of this word, what we like to say, transfer. It allows more transfer and context of what's probably going to happen when they're playing live versus the change of direction, which could be a tool to improve a loading sequence, but it's not necessarily going to be the exact loading sequence you're going to get when you're doing a live reactive movement.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a great point, because I think a lot of people kind of emphasize that inside foot stopping, and they think that in a reactive situation, that's what occurs. But like you said, the angle of force application for that outside leg. So if I'm going to my left and I have to go back to my right, my left leg is going to be the one that's primarily contributing to my braking and propulsive and pushing me back the opposite way. But in a closed change of direction scenario, my right leg will definitely contribute more than it would in a reactive situation.
That's right. You can set it up. I can set it up. I know where my stopping point is. But if I'm playing you one-on-one, I have no idea what you're going to do until you do it. And if I choose the wrong footwork, I'm beat. So intuitively, we want to be quick. So we just reposition and we stab the ground to get our body going in a new direction very quickly.
And another point that I like that you talk about in the basketball speed specialist course is with a shuffle is how a lot of people are taught or told by coaches to not let their feet get close. Can you talk about why the feet actually get close and why that is okay and natural for athletes to actually do?
Yeah. So it's like anything else. It's like if I shoot a jump shot and I stop my hand, I didn't follow through. So I'm not going to have as much force. The initial energy that I put through the ball is going to be cut short because I didn't follow through. Well, the gait is the same way. In this case, it's what we call the lateral gait cycle, which separates it from a normal gait cycle, is each leg has one job to do. As where a normal gait cycle, it has a backside portion of the gait, and it also does the front side. Laterally, we don't do that. So if I'm going to my left, my right leg is always going to be the primary pusher. The front side leg roll is to maintain that momentum that the backside leg gave it. And it does that by pulling. Now, in order for the gait to be complete, the legs have to come back to an area where they can now create full range of motion pressure again into the ground. If I were to shuffle and stop my feet at shoulder width, it would be very difficult for me to create the forces that are necessary to get my body moving up to speed of the potential of my lateral speed. And there are actually people out there that have products that put like this foam thing between your legs so you can't get it's like a 12-inch tube and they want your feet apart. I can't think of a worse way to teach the lateral gait. You're actually hurting it. So you never see an athlete shuffle and their feet all of a sudden get tangled up and they fall down. That doesn't happen. I've been in basketball for almost 50 years and I've never seen that. It's never happened to me. So that's the normal gait cycle. And again, Trevor, going back to just normal human movement, if everybody's doing it, then there's a reason for it. Rather than fighting that reason, why don't we pick up the clues that the nervous system just keeps dropping? It's telling us. We're just not paying attention as a society. What I tried to do a long time ago was and it was hard. I backed off and I said, okay, not only does that fourth grader shuffle and their feet come close together, so doesn't Michael Jordan and LeBron James and Wilt Chamberlain. When I watched old film, they all did it. Mm-hmm. So I started to just pay attention. Somebody's trying to tell me something. I'm not going to fight that because too many people are doing it.
Especially when you look at it with it's like, are they using that skill successfully? Like, are they staying staying in front of their opponent and not falling over, and they're staying balanced and they're still accomplishing their goal as a defender, and those things are occurring? That's like, well, then that's probably just kind of a normal part of the lateral gait cycle of shuffling and that skill overall.
That's right. Exactly.
One of the last things that I want to talk about is like jumping is obviously a huge part of the game of basketball. And I think there's a lot of discussion sometimes on, if you're working with basketball athletes, like, should you be doing jumping because they're, like in your kind of performance training because they are doing so much jumping in practice and in games. Can you talk about your view kind of on that? And it can be, off season, in season, and the kind of different levels of basketball, whether it's, again, like a junior high athlete through college and through pros.
Yeah. Obviously, jumping is a huge part of basketball, not only directly, like going vertical and making something happening in the air, rebounding, getting a shot over somebody, defending somebody in the air, but also indirectly, because being able to produce force quickly allows me to produce force quickly. I don't care if I'm going forward, backwards, sideways. If I've developed that ability, it's going to help me. So jump training and plyometric training can help me with those aspirations to move better. Now, I'm a low volume jumper. I've always believed that there are way too many other things that can impact my basketball players to make them better players, like just being efficient movers as they stay closer to the ground. So that's any kind of movement where they're not going vertical, right? If we can do that, there's probably going to be a lot of impact there. Now, if I took a player that was low skill, dribbling the ball, not a great shooter, but one heck of a natural rebounder, that player, I might spend a little more time on jumping, because that's going to impact their game as a youngster, maybe making varsity or making their middle school team. But it also could get somebody a scholarship, and it could get somebody a pro contract, right? Dennis Rodman got him a contract. If he couldn't jump, not so sure he makes it to the levels he does. He was able to jump pretty high, but he was able to jump very quickly and very multi-directional, doing multi-directional very quickly. So when we train, if we're going to start with a younger kid, we want to do something that I like to call land to protect. So we're going to work on this landing concept of how can we land, not just from going straight up and straight down, but also maybe I jump and I get pushed on my right shoulder when I'm in the air. Now I'm rotating and I'm flexing. How do I land that? It might be a left foot, right foot landing, so a 1-2 landing. But how can I land that and be safe and be confident? So we're going to give multiple strategies and techniques to get the player to be able to know where they are in time and space, right? Their body and their limbs in space. So we're going to call those land to protect. And we have multiple variations of that, especially with our younger kids. Then as they get older, it just becomes intuitive because they've been exposed to it more. The more they get hit every time they jump, it's like, all right, the body's like, yeah, I've been there before. I felt that. I can manage that. Then we have land to perform. Land to perform is when I'm going to land and I'm probably going to have to do something else really well right after that. I might have to re-jump again. I might have to shuffle right out of that, or I might have to land. Maybe I didn't get the rebound, but I'm facing the backboard and my teammate got the rebound. Now I got a hip turn and get out on the break. So I need to land well first, and that should be established as a young developing athlete. And then as I get older, we can revisit those for sure. We want to protect them. But then I got to learn to perform off those landings and then re-jump, re-establish speed or whatever it might be. And the reason I say I'm a low volume jumper is because number one, I think there's too many other things that we can really focus on that are going to impact players. Not that I don't think jumping does. I'm a big fan of being able to be explosive in jumping. I just don't put a ton of volume into it. But I also think, jumping can very quickly start a snowball effect of dysfunction or acute or chronic pain because we've overdone it. And maybe we didn't have a structure that was handling it really well. And we didn't do enough strength training to handle the tremendous volume that some of these programs put into jumping. And now we have an athlete that can't really play because they're hurt. And it doesn't have to be an injury that takes them out of the game. It's just like, oh, my knees, they hurt all the time. And that's because of poor programming. When I get in season, I do not do scheduled jumping other than with players who are not getting a lot of playing time. And even in that case, it's usually concentric jumping, which is they're going to jump up to something. If I'm on the basketball court, we jump up under a bleacher. That's pulled out. They just jump up, land, step down. So at least I'm getting the ballistic force that they need to help them perform.
I think that's a great answer of how can you apply. I love the idea of land to protect versus land to perform, and kind of when we can apply that with our different athletes. And again, I think from a rehab and physical therapy perspective, I think kids should spend more time getting athletes to learn to land and protect themselves. And again, especially going back to a sport like basketball, where they're handling contact and collisions in the air, to be able to kind of reorient your body and land safely and with confidence is such a huge part of getting back to sport. But then, like you said, sometimes when you hit the ground, you got to be able to do something else. So how can we transition kind of back into that land to perform idea is great. Do you think, so with like the low volume jumping, do you does that change for you as an athlete develops? Are you low volume kind of all the time with your younger athletes who maybe don't have the, like, to a certain degree, if an athlete doesn't have the force production capabilities, it's like harder for them to like be overtrained because they just can't push themselves hard enough to accumulate like a high volume and high intensity. Do you, with your junior high, younger athletes, do you do larger volumes of jumping, or do you kind of always stay the same with that?
Yeah, so and when I think about volumes, I'm talking primarily about big, massive jumps, not like line jumps. Yeah, pogos. Those I'll go a little higher. Now, the other thing to always consider with the younger athletes, and I've seen it with my own children, but also being a physical education teacher, I had 400 kids a day that I had access to be able to, they were kind of my guinea pigs. I could do a lot of stuff, and I did a lot of this type of training with them. Here's the thing. When we look at a youngster and we say they don't have enough force to be able to really have that volume hurting, well, when they don't have enough force, they usually don't have enough strength. If they don't have enough strength, there's a lot of times not enough stability. Mm-hmm. So it's relative. You and I, who might have the ability to produce quick force and very powerful, because we're getting really high and we're coming down, that's going to be pretty demanding on our bodies. Well, it's relative to the young kid because they might not get very high, but to them, it's still a lot of force on young musculature, tendon, and joints that aren't stable. So even that lower volume is going to be inefficient for them with high volumes, just because they don't have the eccentric forces and the stability within those forces to handle it. So I'm just very cautious, because I always think if I can live for another day, get a win today, and that win can be anything, but I save them so when they come back the next day, they're still feeling good. That's a good thing. Then I can build on it, versus going just that extra rep or that extra set because I feel like, they need more, and then it was too much. So that's why I'm always on the low end. But the one thing I will say is I'm 100% effort. So if we do, let's say a youngster only did 2 sets of 4 or 5 hard jumps, it's hard jumps. Right. Push as hard as you can, and then get out of it, because now the central nervous system has something to work with and to create a pattern that is going to be effective to be able to land to perform.
Yeah, I think that looking at training as a marathon, as a lifetime of training, not necessarily trying to have one great session today and being out the rest of the week because you're too beat up and your knees or ankles or whatever are too sore is a really good way to kind of look at the long-term development of youth athletes.
Yeah, exactly. And they're going to play anyway, right? They're going to do something probably with their team, or, my son right now is in school and they have phys ed and they play. And then at lunch, they play basketball during lunch. So he's getting a lot of exposure. Then he goes to practice afterwards. So I'm like, so they're getting more exposures than sometimes we think about, than just when they train with us for 45 to an hour,
Well, this is awesome, Lee. Thank you so much for your time. Can you tell our listeners where they can learn more about the Certified Basketball Speed Specialist course and all the other content and products that you've made?
Well, thanks so much, Trevor. This was really fun. I always love talking with you because we just have a very similar mindset and how to help these athletes and clients perform. So yeah, if they go to basketballspeedspecialist.com right now, what we're doing is we have what we call an early bird pregame special, and it's $197. And we want to get this out to coaches because I think we need to impact coaches not only with performance but with communication. I want to be able to communicate with coaches and say, hey, are you teaching them the waddle? Are they doing the snap shovel? And we have an open communication. So that's really the reason we did this. So the techniques were solid, but the terminology was on point. And then if people want to follow me, they can go to anything at Lee Taft, and they can pretty much follow me on social media. I try to be active so I can share content for them. But thanks again, Trevor. I appreciate you.
Absolutely. And everybody, we will have all the links to Lee's stuff in the show notes. And thanks everybody for tuning in.
Thank you for listening to the Resilient Performance Podcast. For 10% off our continuing education membership platform, please use promo code PODCAST at our website, resilientperformance.com, and be sure to join our mailing list for monthly exclusive content.